Okay, before I start, I want to say thank you to you all for coming. I'm sure there's lots of exciting things going on in Lisbon tonight, so I appreciate you giving up your time to be here to listen to me. I'd also like to thank Claudia and Joanna for organising this. We've put in a lot of work, and again, I really appreciate that. And I'd also like to apologise. I'm really sorry that I've come to your beautiful country and not used one word of Portuguese. Like most English people, my language skills are quite limited, so I do apologise for talking to you in English. If I go too fast, please just let me know, okay? As Claudia suggested, I'm going to talk about a number of different issues today. The presentation will be divided more or less into two parts. So the first part, I will be talking about this concept of cosmopolitanism. And I have to confess that I'm a little bit critical of it. It's become very popular in sociology, anthropology, and I have some problems with the literature on this concept. So in the first part, I want to talk a little bit about these issues and my own criticisms. And one of those criticisms will lead into the second part, which will look at the importance, what I think the ongoing importance is of the nation to many people today. So that's kind of the overview of what I'm going to talk about. I should also tell you that most of my examples will be coming from England. Okay, so I will try and provide some context for my examples. But again, if you have any questions or you'd like to know a little bit more, just let me know. But before I get into the main body of my presentation, I'd like to start with a little example, which was an email that was sent to me by a company called Airbnb. How many of you have heard of Airbnb? For those of you who don't know, Airbnb is an organisation that allows people to rent out rooms in their house or their entire house for holiday makers. So at this moment in time, I have a nice little apartment in Alfama, which I rent out from a very nice Portuguese man, and my partner and I are staying there. And about 3 months ago, by the way, I don't work for Airbnb, so this is not a promotional attempt. I got what I thought was a really interesting, and let me just show you it, in case you don't believe me. I thought it was a really interesting email, which is this one. And the title of the email was Belong Anywhere. And I looked at that and thought, wow, that seems to pick up on some of the things that those scholars of cosmopolitanism are talking about. Yeah, this idea that increasing numbers of people travel around the world and feel at home in different places around the world. This idea that increasing numbers of people want to engage with other cultures, other people. So I clicked on this email because I was intrigued by this idea of belonging anywhere. This is what I found. And this bit is in Portuguese. And there's a little promotional advert for Airbnb. And I just want to play you it, because I think it's quite interesting. Because I think it feeds into some of these debates around cosmopolitanism. You'll see that. Okay, so there is a reason for me showing you this. Because I think it feeds in, as I say, to some of these debates around cosmopolitanism. This idea of belonging anywhere. This idea of connection with other people. But at the same time, and there's also another thing that I found quite interesting about it, is it doesn't talk about countries. It talks about cities. It talks about London, it talks about Shanghai, it talks about New York, it talks about Delhi. And I think that's actually quite important in relation to some of these ideas around cosmopolitanism. The nation isn't that important anymore. It's cities that we now focus on, and it's global cities where people can feel at home. But there's another thing to say about this advert and about this idea as well. Because I'm very sceptical about this idea of anywhere. Because I don't think that Airbnb are referring to ghettos in American cities. I don't think they're referring to favelas in Rio. I don't think they're referring to shanty towns in South Africa. And also, who are the people that they are addressing? They're not necessarily global elites, I don't think. But they are what, say, Janet Wiles has called middling migrants, or middling travellers. These are kind of middle-class people, relatively affluent, who are able to take advantage of this opportunity. So it's a very specific type of place that is being talked about, and it's a very specific type of person that is being talked about as well. And I think this also, this kind of criticism or this scepticism about this type of advert can be used to focus on ideas around cosmopolitanism as well. Who are the particular people that we're talking about? What are the things that they are doing when they engage with others? And in what particular places is this engagement happening? Okay, so that's my little example just to kick us off. So back to the PowerPoint. So this is the plan for the rest of the presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about cosmopolitanism. In general terms, first of all, about how the concept has been broadly defined in the literature, about how it has been studied, and then I want to make a number of suggestions about how we can kind of advance our understanding of these engagements with other people. And I'll talk about that in relation to the importance of understanding power. Because I think sometimes the literature fails to address the fact that these engagements take place between people who have access to different resources and who are operating under far different constraints or opportunities. And I also want to say that I think it's really important that when we study cosmopolitanism, we offer a kind of longitudinal dimension. A lot of the literature tends to look at a particular moment in time and says, here's an example of cosmopolitanism in practice. And what I want to say is that we need to introduce a really important temporal dimension and ask, when are people engaging with others? At what moments does this happen? Now this might seem kind of obvious, right? And yet if you look at a lot of the literature around this topic, it doesn't do that. It doesn't ask these sorts of questions. And in order to kind of highlight or evidence the approach that I'm arguing for, I want to give you a couple of examples. Again, I'm afraid they're drawn from the English case. One relates to sport. The second relates to the everyday talk of ordinary people. And I want to show you the shifts that take place if you adopt a more longitudinal, over time perspective. And one of the other criticisms, as I say, I have of cosmopolitanism is that it doesn't address seriously enough the value of established social formations. Whether that be class, whether that be religion, whether that be ethnicity, or whether it be, in this case, the nation. And in the second part of my talk, I want to try and address this issue seriously. Because from my own research, I've talked to a lot of people, and ideas around nationhood, belonging to the nation, is really quite important to them. And again, I want to show you some evidence of this from everyday conversations with a variety of people, again, from England. And the focus here in particular will be on what I've called the ethnic majority. Okay, so a lot of the literature focuses on ethnic minorities, and the emphasis is on the kind of more precarious position within a given country. But what about those people whose place within Britain, or place within France, or indeed Portugal is taken for granted? Their identity is not subject to scrutiny. Their identity is not questioned. What do they get from this powerful position, this dominant position? And this is what I want to address in the second half of the presentation. Oh, this is the promotional slide. I show you the very pretty picture on the front cover of my book. Unfortunately, it's really expensive, so I won't recommend you go out and buy it, because you won't have any money. But at least you get to see the nice picture.
And if you share the paper, you will be
Yeah, you can get the paper for free, so I would stick with that. Okay, one of the things I don't want to say is that processes of globalization aren't important, aren't significant, aren't transforming some aspects of our lives. Many of you sitting in front of me are from other parts of the world, right? Or have been to other parts of the world, or know people from other parts of the world. Yeah, so processes of globalization matter. They matter empirically because more and more people are traveling, more and more people are living abroad, more and more people have access to products and images and ideas from other parts of the world. And they matter theoretically because these debates have been really important in helping us think critically about the usefulness of things like the concept of society, or the concept of culture, or the value of traditional sociological theories and concepts. So I don't want to say that globalization isn't important, and that it doesn't matter, and that we don't take mobility seriously. The other thing, in terms of methodology, I'm not sure whether you've come across this term before, this idea of methodological nationalism, which is the approach in much of the social sciences that starts with the nation as the focus for our studies. So the interest is in what's going on in Britain, or what's going on in France, or what's going on in Portugal. So we collect data that relates to the Portuguese population or the French population. Now there's an argument that these sorts of approaches aren't allowing us to capture new forms of migration. Life lived across borders, transnational processes, for example. And again, I agree. We do need to think about how these mobilities change the way in which we collect data. Now, one of the arguments that has been made very popular by a German sociologist called Rick Beck is that in order to challenge methodological nationalism, we turn to cosmopolitanism. This is kind of the new concept that helps us to make sense of some of these processes. That we are now entering a new era of cosmopolitan relations that is replacing what went before. Slight problem with that is that what went before also featured profound engagements with other people, also featured examples of cosmopolitan practice. So operating in a very simple kind of dichotomy between cosmopolitan now and nationalism in the past is problematic to me, because there's evidence of cosmopolitanism in apart, and there's also evidence of nationalism operating there. So we need to be very careful about using these kinds of very broad, sweeping macro theories, which is what I think Beck does. One of the other issues that I've written about in relation to cosmopolitanism is how it's defined. Classic definition from Ulf Hannertz many years ago was a willingness to engage with other people. Begs the question, which other people? What does it mean to engage? I mean, these are all fairly obvious questions, right? And yet, again, if you go to the literature on cosmopolitanism, they're not addressed, or not addressed enough, in my opinion. And what I'm asking for is that we move away from these kind of sweeping definitions to think very critically about the sorts of people that are involved in these engagements. To think very critically about their motivations for engaging with other people. Because some will do it willingly, some will be forced to do it. At particular moments, some will do it enthusiastically, at other times they won't do it at all. And what are the other people? Who are the other people they are engaging with? Is it everyone? Is it everyone in the world they're equally engaging with? No, it's probably people who are more like them. You know, the evidence tends to point towards that. The other thing, if you look at the empirical research on cosmopolitanism, is that you will find a whole variety of activities and attitudes that get dumped into this enormous kind of bin marked cosmopolitan. So everything from eating a meal of, foreign, from a foreign country has been defined as cosmopolitan. Supporting a team from another country has been defined as cosmopolitan. Getting involved in a protest movement that moves beyond your own national borders has been defined as cosmopolitan. Buying a CD by a foreign group has been defined as cosmopolitan. These are all patently different things, with very different motivations and very different reasons that people get involved in these practices. And we need to think very critically about why they're getting involved. And as I say, that we also need to incorporate this temporal dimension. Is at particular moments, yes, people engage with others, and they do it for certain reasons. But at other times, they have absolutely no interest in engaging with other people. Why is that? And I think the temporal dimension, addressing the question of when, also makes us think quite critically about how we collect our data. So a lot of the research has been based on ethnographic studies, which obviously tell us quite a lot about a very small number of people. But if we wanted to do a quantitative analysis of cosmopolitan, what would our population be? What would our sum be? And I don't think those sorts of questions have been engaged with enough either. So let me just put forward a couple of typologies which I think might be quite useful in trying to understand how these different practices and attitudes and people can be kind of related to each other. And again, I'm not claiming that this is kind of rocket science. A lot of it seems fairly obvious. But again, I don't think much of the literature engages in this way. So, can we have different aspects in terms of cultural, political, economic forms of cosmopolitanism? So Beck talks about the importance of food. Going into the supermarket and buying food from a variety of different regions or areas. Paul Kennedy has looked at those who work within international organisations like the United Nations, the European Union. So working with people from a wide variety of backgrounds, universities, including obvious design. Those tend to involve people who are relatively affluent, who are educated to a high degree, have a relative range of resources to rely on. Others have studied more marginal cosmopolitans, entrepreneurs living in places in Europe quite often who have to engage with tourists, for example, from a wide variety of backgrounds. They have to learn their language in order to sell themselves. So they're not able to rely on as wide a range of resources, but they're still engaging with others. And what about those who get involved in these social movements, who in some cases lay down their lives for other people who are not from their locality or their nation? It seems to me that, eating foreign food is not the same thing as getting involved in an environmental campaign, and yet both of them get labelled as cosmopolitans. Very different people being engaged with, very different motivations, very different consequences. Another thing we might want to think about is the extent to which these engagements are largely now taken for granted. We don't even think about them anymore. So, university lectures often feature students from a wide variety of different cultural, national, and backgrounds. No one even thinks about that. So there are more reflexive and more banal forms of cosmopolitanism. Some people forced to engage with others, even though they don't want to. Others now taking it as a matter of course. It's just part of their life and what they do. And the final typology that I just want to briefly talk about is the progressive versus the regressive forms of cosmopolitanism. Because when it's talked about in the literature, and it's talked about theoretically or normatively, it's this idea that engaging with others is a good thing. Yeah. It makes us better people. It makes us understand other people's ways of life, their culture, their traditions, and by definition that is something that should be encouraged. And there's a nice example which I stole from my friend's blog about his daughter donating some money to the people of Haiti after the earthquake, the most recent earthquake. This would seem to be the classic example of engaging with others, trying to benefit them. But there are, of course, other engagements with others that are not progressive in this way. And a striking example of that comes from a study by O'Connell Davidson and Jackie Sanchez-Taylor, who were looking at sex tourists in places like the Dominican Republic. And they talked to some of these men, most of whom came from the US and Europe. And they talked to them about what they were doing. And their justification was that they wanted to engage with other people. This is classic cosmopolitan language. And yes, of course, we would not we might get angry about what they're doing, but we would not see this as a good thing. I think we need to be very careful, and we need some sort of continuum that says some of these engagements are very positive and are to be welcomed, and yet there are other countless examples that are deeply, deeply problematic. Okay, I want to whip through a couple of examples to show this temporal dimension and the benefits of studying these processes over time. The first one comes from an analysis of newspaper reporting of the appointment of an English football manager. Now, you don't need to know anything about English football or this particular individual. All you do need to know is that he was a foreigner. He was the first foreign English football manager. And at the time, there was a huge amount of debate in England about this issue. Because the manager of the English football team is kind of seen to be a kind of icon of the nation. I don't know if you have a similar debate in Portugal.
Unfortunately not.
Or no?
Joking. No.
Okay.
We don't care if it's Portuguese or not.
Okay.
We don't have any Portuguese player already.
Well, that's interesting to know. In England, it matters a lot. And the first guy, he was a Swedish manager. He'd been very successful as a club manager in Europe. He won lots of honours, lots of championships. And I just want to show you very briefly some of the reporting about this individual. And then I'll show you a couple of examples, very, very different examples, from everyday conversations that I had with ordinary people in England. And I'm going to whip through these quite quickly. So this is the chap. He's a man called Sven-Göran Eriksson, and he was born in Sweden, and he became the English football manager in 2001. This was his record, which was quite good for an English football manager. England generally don't do very well. And his two major achievements was that he took England to 2 World Cup quarter-finals. So you can see how bad English football is when that's an achievement. Anyway, let me just show you. So what I did, I tracked newspaper reporting about this individual when he became the manager, after key matches, and when he left his job. And when he was appointed as the first foreign-born English football manager, it was quite interesting to know that there were 2 kind of sides, 2 positions that these newspaper reports took. The first was very pragmatic. The first, one could argue, was quite cosmopolitan. Yeah. The focus was not on his nationality. The focus was on his achievements, on his success as a manager. But it was also quite interesting. They talked about him, and this is a direct quote. He was cultured. He spoke a number of different languages, which seems to be a wonderful thing in England because no one does that. He was seen to be worldly. He was into literature and art. He seemed to be very sophisticated. Worth noting this, us, is the English population. Let us, the English population, judge him on his achievements. Doesn't matter where he's from, if he's good, if he makes England successful, that's a wonderful thing. Second response, slightly different. How do you read it? This is my favourite one. Doesn't matter if the previous managers were rubbish, at least they were English. So it's not about success, it's not about your individual achievements as a person, as a sporting professional, it's about your nationality. Long time ago, 2001, England played in the World Cup qualifier against Germany, and by some miracle or other, they won 5-1. And the reports afterwards I thought were quite interesting, because he's now moved from this kind of sophisticated, cultured, worldly figure, and he's now, he's in charge. It's his team. He has become accepted as one of us, because of course England. So they're his lions. However, he wasn't always as successful as that. So he became a figure of fun. I do have a clip on YouTube. I don't have time to show you it. But it's worth noting here that the English players are still the lions, but they're no longer Ericsson's life. And actually, his kind of cultured, worldly, sophisticated outlook is now a problem because he can't motivate the English players. So if we look at this, it's a very, very pragmatic form of openness to a particular individual on the basis of their success and failure. So it's a kind of pragmatic cosmopolitanism, if you will. And it's done for a particular reason, which is, can he lead the English football team to some degree of success? If he can, yes, he's welcome, he's one of us. So the national framework is still very much in operation in relation to this example. And in showing you these next two examples, what I want to kind of emphasize is the kind of messy, complex aspects of social life. And the fact that on the one hand people can be very open, and on the other they can come out with the most horrendous statements about others. So in this example, this is the person I want you to focus on. Leslie says, where you come from makes no difference. And being, or taking this role, taking the enlightened role, is something that people try and do because they don't want to be seen as prejudiced or parochial or favouring their own. They want to be seen as enlightened. And in this case, Leslie can do that, and she forces everyone else in this interview situation to very carefully enunciate their position. In the second example, same person is using a national framework to make sense of a particular issue. So in this case, she's offering a kind of cosmopolitan framework for making sense of what's going on. Where you come from doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter if you're British, it doesn't matter if you're American. In this case, she's trying to make sense of the perceived gap between her group, the British, and this other lot, the French, who she can't really understand. And this is where national frameworks come in to help her make sense of the situation. And this is, I don't see enough of this in the literature of cosmopolitanism. Trying to understand when people draw on or put forward a more open outlook and when they go back to tried and trusted frameworks for understanding the world. How long do you want me to speak for? Have I bored everyone's tears yet? Because I can stop here, or I can go on for a little bit and whip through the second part. Would you like me to stop now?
Maybe some more minutes.
Okay, I'll give you... Okay, so in terms of cosmopolitanism, one of the things, and this draws on the work of Zlatko Skribis and Ian Woodward, based in Australia, this argument that we need to think about cosmopolitanism much more critically as an outlook or a perspective that at certain moments comes to the fore for particular reasons. There are reasons that people engage with. But there's also, and this is what I wanted to talk about, and I'll have to be very brief now, is that people continue to draw on established frameworks, and the one I'm interested in is the nation, because it offers them something, and that this is not discussed in the literature enough. Because cosmopolitan good, nationalism bad. And operating again in that sort of dichotomy is deeply problematic. We don't have to like the ways in which people use national frameworks, but we need to understand why they do it. Okay. And in order to understand why national frameworks continue to matter to certain people, I want to draw on two bodies of literature. The first relates to everyday nation. And this is an argument that comes from Michael Billig's work around nationalism, which is that nationalism isn't just about war or conflict or political extremism, but that our understanding of nationalism is generated through countless everyday features, institutional frameworks, forms of talk, symbols. Let me give you a couple of examples. In this case, the weather is being understood through a national framework. We have weather in England, in Wales, in Scotland, and in Northern Ireland. But we don't have any weather here in the Republic of Ireland because it's the UK news, and the Republic of Ireland is not part of the UK. Okay? So even something as obvious as the weather is talked about in national terms. Let me give you an example a bit closer to here. This is, and I'm sorry for the crappy quality of the photo, I took this on my mobile phone. This is an example of wine and grapes being nationalised. Truth is, this variety has no nationality, for it is a blend between Petit Bouschet and Grenache. The assumption being that other varieties do have a nationality. Yeah, so it's a common sense framework for making sense of, in this case, the background of grapes and wine. And when we go into a shop to buy a bottle of wine, we will often think in terms of nations. I want one from Chile, I want one from Italy, I want one from France, I want one from Portugal. And we do this as a matter of course. When we meet someone new, where are you from? I'm from France. So immediately a number of things appear in your mind. They will speak French. They will know something about Paris. But, you know, you have these ideas in your head in relation to where this person comes from. And it helps us make sense of the world, and therefore it is valuable because it helps us make sense of the world. It helps us engage with other people. Through that. The second argument I want to put forward in terms of the value of an established national framework draws on the literature from sociology of everyday life, which suggests that our sense of who we are and our relations with others and our place in the world is related to everyday routines, everyday forms of language, everyday institutional frameworks, education, the media, government, business, advertising. All of these things help us make sense of who we are and where we belong. And one of the arguments I want to put forward is the nation is one of those frameworks communicated through everyday routines and practices and symbols that gives us a sense of what Anthony Giddens calls ontological security. This idea that we will wake up tomorrow more or less being the same person we were yesterday and having the same sorts of relations with the same sorts of people as we did yesterday. And one of the aspects of who we are for many people around the world is that they will be from a given nation. So tomorrow, I'm not going to wake up French or Portuguese, even if I wanted to, even if I wished for it every. Okay, so a sense of place, community, comes from, for many people around the world, the nation. Not for everyone, and obviously there are other important social formations that matter to people, but the nation gives many people around the world a sense of who they are and where they belong. However, there are some groups within the nation that are seen to belong more than others. And this is what I was talking about in relation to the ethnic majority. The ethnic majority are the people who belong without question. They are the ones who kind of define the conditions of belonging, if you like. So in Western Europe, one of the key markers of belonging was often whiteness. So if you're white, you were seen to belong without question. It doesn't have to be race. You know, there's a whole host of features that can be used in a particular national setting to mark you off as belonging more or less. And what I want to argue is that those who are seen to belong without question get a really important sense of power, and agency, and authority from being positioned in that way. And that is why nations, again, continue to matter to different people around the world. And I'm running out of time now. I'll just give you one example of this is a woman talking about, she's talking about migration. She's talking about mobility. And in this case, she's talking about her own mobility. She's gone on holiday. She's come back into the country, and there's a passport officer sitting at the desk in front. And it's a woman wearing an Islamic veil, who is the passport officer. And she's absolutely appalled by it, because she does not recognise that person as someone who should have authority over her, because it's her country. Now, we might not like this, yeah, as good liberals, as good cosmopolitans. We might find this problematic. But one of my arguments is that in order to understand why nations matter, in this case, her national identity, her belonging to the nation, gives her a sense of power and dominance over other people. And that is why considerable numbers still continue to kind of challenge migration. That is why migration is such a big issue in the UK, for example. Not only the UK, but France, Sweden, America. Because those who feel that they are, you know, they own the country, they feel that they are losing this sense of power. Now, I really am. So, just in conclusion, I think we need to think very, very critically about this concept, because otherwise it becomes just a conceptual dumping ground for a whole variety of different practices that don't actually have much to do with each other than that they're labelled cosmopolitan. And that we need to think about how meaningful they are to the people involved and the motivations and consequences of these many different practices. And as I've tried to emphasise, there needs to be, I think, a temporal dimension in thinking about engagements with others. So when do people engage with particular others and for what reason? And that yes, we need to acknowledge that globalising processes are absolutely fundamental, but that doesn't mean sweeping away the significance of already established social formations, and in this case I've talked about the nation. And finally, we need to take seriously why frameworks associated with the nation continue to matter to people. Now that doesn't mean we agree with what they say. That doesn't mean we agree with this woman when she refuses to recognise a British Muslim as British. But we need to understand where she's coming from in order to try and make sense of what is going on in this particular setting. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.